The headlights caught the void first, a sudden absence where the road should have continued, and Willa Grayson felt her breath stop as the car slid to a halt, just inches from the edge where the bridge had been only that morning. Rain hammered the windshield, turning the world beyond the glass into a watercolor blur of black and darker black. The river that should have been 30 feet below now churned barely 10 feet from the road, rising visibly as they watched, swallowing the bank in greedy gulps. Beside her, Hadrian Ravencroft sat utterly still, his pale hands loose on the steering wheel, white hair pulled back from a face that might have been carved from marble centuries ago, which it had been, in a sense. 463 years ago, to be precise, when the turning had frozen him in the prime of his mortal life and set him on a path that would eventually lead to a throne, a kingdom hidden beneath the modern world, and to this moment staring at an impassable gap with dawn less than 6 hours away. The bridge, Willa said, unnecessarily, because of course he could see it. Or rather, see the lack of it. Twisted metal jutted from both banks where the supports had been. The storm that had raged through the mountains for 3 days had finally claimed its prize. "The registry office is in Millbrook," Hadrian said quietly. His voice carried the faint accent of old money and older bloodlines, the kind that had watched empires rise and crumble. 23 miles on the far side of this river. Willa knew. She had memorized every detail of this journey, this deadline, this impossible piece of bureaucracy that stood between her family's land and the rival who wanted it. Lord Severin, ancient and cruel, who had unearthed some half-forgotten claim from 2 centuries past that said the valley her family had worked for generations belonged by right to his house. The claim lapsed only if it went unchallenged for exactly 200 years, and that deadline fell at midnight tonight. Except the mortal courts did not recognize vampire law. The mortal courts, which governed the land itself regardless of who walked it in darkness, required a marriage registered in their own records. And Willa's marriage to Hadrian, performed 3 nights ago in the depths of his court with all the old rituals and blood oaths, meant nothing to the clerks at the Millbrook Civil Registry. They needed a signature in a leather-bound book before sunrise. Without it, Severin's claim would stand, and her family would lose everything. "We could go back," Willa said, though she knew before the words left her mouth that there was no back to go to. The only other road had washed out yesterday. This route was supposed to be the safe one. Hadrian turned to look at her, and even in the dim glow of the dashboard lights his eyes were startling. Pale gray, almost silver, framed by white lashes that should have made him look fragile but instead made him look otherworldly. Dangerous, beautiful in the way that winter was beautiful, all clean lines and deadly cold. "We cross," he said simply. Willa stared at him, then at the river, which was now lapping at the broken edges of the asphalt. The rain showed no signs of stopping. The water was black and furious, full of debris from upstream, tree branches and pieces of buildings and things she did not want to examine too closely. "That's impossible," she said. "I have crossed worse." He was already opening his door, stepping out into the storm. Rain soaked him instantly, plastering his white shirt to his shoulders, but he did not seem to notice. Vampires did not feel the cold the way humans did. Willa scrambled out after him, gasping as the wind hit her like a fist. Her coat was immediately useless, rain finding every gap and seam. Hadrian came around the car to her side, moving with that unnatural grace that still startled her sometimes, even after 6 months of knowing what he was. They had met at a city council meeting of all places. Hadrian had sat in the back row, silent and attentive, listening to her argue for agricultural subsidies for small family farms. She had noticed him because everyone noticed him, this stranger with his antique face and expensive suit. But she had not spoken to him until afterward, when he had approached her in the parking lot and told her, with perfect courtesy, that Severin was preparing to challenge her family's claim to their valley. He had explained the vampire world to her then, standing under the streetlights while moths circled overhead. The hidden courts, the old laws, the way immortal grievances could stretch across centuries and suddenly snap tight around mortal lives. He had offered his help, and she had been suspicious, because nobody offered help without wanting something in return. What Hadrian wanted, it turned out, was her. Or more precisely, He wanted a wife who could anchor his claim to lands that bordered her valley, strengthening his position against rivals like Severin, who still challenged his relatively young reign. He had been king for only 70 years, and there were vampires far older who resented his power. It should have been a cold transaction, a marriage of pure political convenience. But somewhere in the negotiations, in the long nights of planning and strategizing, Willa had discovered that Hadrian was not the remote, calculating creature she had expected. He was careful, yes, and controlled. But underneath the ancient formality was someone who listened when she spoke, who asked about her life and her family with genuine interest, who had stood beside her at her grandmother's funeral and held her hand with a tenderness that had nothing to do with political alliances. And when he had asked her, 3 weeks ago, if she would mind terribly if their arrangement became something more than an arrangement, she had kissed him instead of answering, and he had responded with a passion that had nothing immortal about it, nothing cold or distant. Just heat and need and a desperate longing that suggested he had been alone for far too long. The wedding in his court had been beautiful and strange, full of rituals she did not fully understand, but had participated in gladly, because Hadrian had stood across from her with his heart in his eyes, visible for once, unguarded. He had sworn oaths in languages dead for 1,000 years, and then in plain English he had promised to protect her, to honor her, to stand between her and any darkness that might come. She had not expected to feel what she felt now, standing in the rain beside him, staring at the impossible river. She had not expected love. But there it was, sitting in her chest like a second heartbeat, stubborn and undeniable. "You cannot swim that," she said, raising her voice over the wind. "I will not be swimming." Hadrian turned to face the river fully, studying it with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. "The current will carry us downstream, but the angle should bring us to the far bank within 2 miles. There is high ground there. I have seen the maps." "You have seen maps," Willa repeated. "Hadrian, that water is moving fast enough to carry cars." "Yes." He looked at her again, and something in his expression softened. He reached out and tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear, his fingers cold against her cheek. "Which is why you will be on my shoulders, well above it. I am stronger than I look, beloved. The river cannot have you." The endearment did what it always did, sent a warm shock through her chest even as her practical mind was listing all the ways this plan could fail. She wanted to argue, wanted to find another solution, but the river was rising and dawn was coming and there was no time for anything but this. "If we do not make it," she started. "We will make it." His voice carried absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that came from 4 centuries of surviving impossible things. "I have not kept you safe this long to lose you to weather." Willa thought of Severin, waiting in his own court for news of their failure. The old vampire had made it clear he would contest the claim regardless, but without the mortal marriage registration, he would win. Her family would be forced to sell, to leave the valley that had been theirs since before there were proper deeds and titles, back when ownership meant the willingness to work the land and defend it. She thought of her younger brother, who was studying agriculture at the state university and dreamed of bringing new techniques to their orchards. Of her mother, who had buried her husband in the valley cemetery and intended to rest beside him someday. Of the people who worked the harvest, who depended on the Grayson family to keep the land in responsible hands. "All right," she said. "Tell me what to do." Hadrian moved quickly then, stripping off his jacket and tie, unbuttoning his cuffs and rolling his sleeves to his elbows. Willa caught a glimpse of the scars on his forearms, faint white lines that had survived even the turning, marks from his mortal life. He had been a ferryman's son, he had told her once, in a river town that no longer existed. He understood water. "We leave everything here," he said, nodding toward the car, "except your identification and the marriage certificate. Those go in the waterproof bag I keep in the trunk for emergencies." Of course he had a waterproof bag for emergencies. Willa retrieved her license and the ornate certificate from the vampire ceremony, while Hadrian produced a sealed dry bag that looked military grade. He tucked the documents inside, checked the seal twice, and then handed it to her. "Inside your shirt," he said, "secured against your body. If we are separated, which we will not be, you still have what you need." Willa did as he instructed, feeling the bag settle cold against her ribs. When she looked up, Hadrian was crouching slightly, his back to her. "Climb on," he said. "Legs around my waist, arms around my neck, but not so tight that you choke me. I do not technically need to breathe, but it is still unpleasant." She had never ridden on anyone's shoulders since she was a child, and that had been sitting upright, the way children did at parades. This was different, clinging to his back like a pack, trusting him to bear her weight. She climbed on awkwardly, feeling his hands come up to steady her thighs, his grip firm and sure. "Tighter," he said. "You cannot hurt me, Willa. Hold on as if your life depends on it, because it does." She locked her arms around his neck, pressed her body against his back, and felt him rise smoothly to his full height. He did not stagger or adjust his balance. He simply stood, as if her weight was nothing, and walked toward the edge of the road. "Do not let go," he said quietly. "No matter what happens, do not let go. I will have you. I will always have you." Then he stepped off the road and into the river. The cold was a shock despite her soaked clothes, water surging up to swallow them both. For one terrible moment, Willa thought they would simply go under, be dragged down into the black depths. But then Hadrian's head broke the surface, and his steady, powerful strokes began pulling them forward. The current seized them immediately, yanking them sideways, but Hadrian angled against it, swimming with a strength that was definitely not human. Willa kept her face pressed against his shoulder, feeling the muscles work beneath his shirt, feeling the water try to pry her loose. Her legs tightened around his waist, her arms locked around his neck, and she made herself breathe, slow and steady, because panicking would help nothing. The rain was relentless, turning the surface of the river into a chaos of colliding drops. Debris rushed past them, tree branches scraping against her legs, something larger and heavier bumping Hadrian's side hard enough to make him grunt. But he did not slow, did not falter. He swam as if he could do this forever, as if carrying her through a flood was merely inconvenient rather than impossible. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only the cold, the dark, the rhythm of Hadrian's strokes, and the trust that he would not let her fall. Willa found herself talking, though she did not remember deciding to speak, her voice pitched just loud enough for him to hear over the storm. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the valley," she said, lips close to his ear. "About the first Graysons who settled there, back when it was wilderness. They built the first cabin in one summer, her and my grandfather, just the two of them. No electricity, no running water. She said they nearly froze that first winter, but they stayed because the land was worth it, because it was theirs." Hadrian's rhythm did not change, but she felt him listening, felt the attention he paid even while navigating the flood. "She made me promise," Willa continued, "the day before she died. Made me promise I would not let anyone take it. Not developers, not the bank, not anyone. I told her I would protect it, whatever it took." She pressed her forehead against his shoulder. "I did not know what it would take." "Does it frighten you?" Hadrian asked, his voice steady despite the exertion. "What? You have married?" Willa had to think about that. 6 months ago, the answer would have been yes. The vampire world was dangerous, full of old feuds and older cruelties, governed by laws that valued power over mercy. But Hadrian had been patient with her fear, had answered every question, had never asked her to simply trust blindly. He had shown her his court, introduced her to his people, explained the structure of vampire society with the same care he might use teaching a complicated legal system. And he had shown her himself, slowly, in pieces, the way he still loved music from his mortal life, old ballads that had been new when he was young, the way he read voraciously, trying to keep up with the centuries of change, filling libraries with books on everything from agriculture to astrophysics, the way he was scrupulously fair in his judgments, unwilling to abuse the power he held, determined to be better than the tyrants who had come before him. "You do not frighten me," she said finally. "Sometimes the situation frightens me, the politics, the danger, the fact that you have enemies who would hurt me to hurt you. But you, yourself, no, you have never frightened me." She felt him adjust his angle slightly, compensating for a shift in the current. "I am glad," he said quietly. I have spent a very long time being something to fear. It is unexpectedly pleasant to be something else." They fell silent for a while, and Willa realized the bank was closer now, the dark line of trees visible through the rain. But they were also moving downstream fast, being carried by the current despite Hadrian's efforts. 2 miles, he had said. She wondered how he could possibly know where they were in this darkness, this chaos. "There," Hadrian said suddenly, and she looked up to see a break in the trees, a small clearing where the ground rose sharply. He angled toward it, his strokes more urgent now, fighting the current that wanted to pull them past. For a moment Willa thought they would miss it, be swept onward into the dark. But then Hadrian's foot found purchase on something beneath the surface, a rock or a submerged log, and he used it to launch them toward the shore. They hit the muddy bank hard, Hadrian staggering forward with Willa still clinging to his back. He climbed the slope on hands and knees, her weight driving him down, but he did not stop until they were well above the waterline, into the shelter of the trees. Then he lowered himself carefully to the ground, and Willa slid off his back, her legs shaking so badly she nearly fell. Hadrian caught her elbow, steadying her, and in the faint light that filtered through the storm clouds, she could see his face, pale and set, his eyes bright with an intensity that might have been relief or might have been triumph. "We are across," he said. Willa started laughing, though it came out half like sobbing, adrenaline and terror and amazement all tangled together. "You are insane," she said. That was insane. It was necessary. But he was almost smiling, a rare softening of his usually controlled features. Then the smile faded as he looked past her, toward the trees. "And we are not finished. Millbrook is still 2 miles north, and we have perhaps 4 hours until dawn." Willa checked the dry bag, found it still sealed tight against her ribs, and nodded. "Then we walk." They walked. The forest was dense and dark, the ground treacherous with mud and hidden roots, but Hadrian moved through it as if he could see perfectly, which he probably could. He kept one hand wrapped around Willa's, pulling her along when she stumbled, supporting her when the exhaustion threatened to drag her down. Her clothes were soaked through, heavy with water, and the wind cut through the fabric like knives. She was shivering violently within minutes, her teeth chattering so hard she could not speak. Hadrian noticed, of course, and stopped, stripping off his soaked shirt and wrapping it around her shoulders over her own wet coat. "That does not help," Willa protested through chattering teeth. "You are just as wet as I am." "But I do not feel the cold," Hadrian said. "And you do. Wear it anyway. The extra layer matters." They kept moving, and Willa focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on not thinking about the distance still ahead or the time slipping away. She thought instead about the registry office, about the board clerk who would stamp their certificate and enter their names into the ledger, making their marriage real in the eyes of the mortal law. She thought about going home to the valley afterward, about walking into her mother's kitchen and saying it was done, the land was safe, Severin had lost. She thought about the future after that, the shape of a life she was still learning to imagine. Hadrian had promised her that nothing would change unless she wanted it to, that she could keep living in the valley, keep running the orchards, keep being human. He would split his time between his court and her home, would be husband and king simultaneously, and somehow make it work. It was an impossible promise, and yet she believed him. He had done impossible things before. "We should reach the road soon," Hadrian said, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. "From there, it is less than a mile to the town." But when they broke through the trees onto what should have been the road, they found only more water. The river had spread beyond its banks, flooding the lowlands, turning the valley into a temporary lake. And across that lake, distant but visible, were the lights of Millbrook, mocking them with their closeness. Willa stared at the water, at the impossible distance, and felt something crack inside her chest. They had come so far, had survived the river crossing, and now this. More water, more impossible distance, and dawn creeping closer with every passing minute. "No," she whispered. "No. We were across. We made it across." Hadrian stood very still beside her, and when Willa looked at his face, she saw something she had never seen there before. Defeat. Just for a moment. Just a flicker. But it was there, and it terrified her more than the flood had. Then he blinked, and the expression was gone, replaced by his usual calm. "There will be high ground," he said, "somewhere to wait until the water recedes enough to cross safely." "We do not have time to wait," Willa said. Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Dawn is in less than 4 hours, and you cannot be caught in the open when the sun rises. I will manage." "Hadrian!" She turned to face him fully, grabbing his arms. "You will burn. That is what happens, is it not? Direct sunlight burns vampires." "It does." He said it calmly, as if they were discussing something abstract and unimportant. "But I am old enough to withstand it for a time if I must. Long enough to find shelter." Willa shook her head, feeling tears mix with the rain on her face. "This is my fault. My family, my land, my problem. You should not have to burn for it. You are my wife." Hadrian reached up and cupped her face in his cold hands, tilting her head up so she had to meet his eyes. "Your problems are my problems. Your fight is my fight, and I knew what I was risking when we left tonight." "Then why did you come?" The question burst out of her, too loud, too raw. "If you knew it might come to this, why did you not send someone else? You have people who could have escorted me, who could have—" "Because I could not let anyone else carry you," Hadrian interrupted, his voice quiet but absolute. "Because if there was danger, if there was any chance you might be hurt, I needed to be the one there. I needed to know that I had done everything possible to keep you safe." His thumb brushed her cheekbone, catching a tear. "Do you understand? I have spent centuries ensuring I am strong enough that I never need anyone, that I can handle any threat alone. But you, Willa, you are the first person in 400 years that I cannot bear to lose." Willa closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I cannot bear to lose you either," she whispered, "and I refuse to win the valley only to watch you burn. Then we find another way." Hadrian pressed a kiss to her forehead, brief and cold and tender. "Come, we are wasting time standing here." They followed the edge of the floodwater north, searching for a crossing point, but the water stretched unbroken as far as they could see. Willa's exhaustion was becoming dangerous now, her legs barely responding, her mind foggy with cold and fatigue. She stumbled over a root she should have seen easily, and Hadrian caught her before she fell, his arm around her waist. "I am all right," she started to say, but he was already lifting her, cradling her against his chest. "You are not all right," he said. "You are hypothermic and exhausted. Let me carry you." She wanted to protest, wanted to insist she could still walk, but the truth was she was not sure she could. So she let her head rest against his shoulder and let him carry her through the storm, trusting him in the darkness. They had gone perhaps half a mile when Hadrian stopped suddenly. Willa lifted her head and saw it, a small structure barely visible through the rain. A shepherd's hut, old and probably abandoned, perched on a rise above the floodwater. Hadrian carried her to it quickly, shouldering open the door, which hung crooked on its hinges. Inside was a single room, empty except for a rough wooden bench against one wall and a rusted iron stove in the corner. The roof was mostly intact, though rain dripped through in places, and the walls blocked the worst of the wind. It was not warm, and it was not comfortable, but it was shelter. Hadrian set Willa down carefully on the bench and immediately went to inspect the stove. There was wood stacked beside it, dry enough to burn, and after a moment of searching, he found an old box of matches tucked into a crack in the wall. "Shepherds," he said, striking a match. "They leave supplies for emergencies. Sensible people." The fire caught quickly, and soon there was real warmth radiating from the stove. Willa stripped off her wet coat with shaking hands and moved closer to the heat, feeling the cold slowly, painfully, begin to recede from her bones. Hadrian stood by the door, staring out at the rain. His back was rigid, his hands clenched into fists, and Willa realized with a start that he was angry. Not at her, she thought, but at the situation, at the water that had trapped them, at his own inability to simply fix this with strength or speed or ancient power. How long until dawn? She asked quietly. 3 hours, perhaps less. He did not turn around. The rain is hiding it, but I can feel the approach. It is like a weight in my bones, the sun. Even before it rises, I know it is coming. Willa moved to stand beside him, her body still shaking with residual cold, but her mind clearer now. We are not going to make it, are we? To Millbrook, I mean, not before sunrise. No, the word was flat, final. We are not. She should have felt devastated, should have been panicking, but instead she felt strangely calm. They had tried. They had done everything possible, had crossed an impossible river and fought through a storm, and sometimes trying was not enough. Sometimes the world simply won. Severin gets the valley, she said. No. Now Hadrian did turn, and his eyes were blazing silver in the dim light. No, he does not. I will not allow it. You cannot stop the law. I can challenge him. Hadrian stepped closer, and Willa could see the fury in his face now, cold and precise and absolutely deadly. The mortal courts will rule in his favor without your registration, yes, but vampire law still applies to vampire business. I will challenge his claim directly before the High Council. I will fight him if I must. He is older than you, Willa said, remembering what Hadrian had told her about Severin. 800 years old, ancient and powerful and cruel. If it comes to a physical challenge, then I will lose. Hadrian said it matter-of-factly. He has age and strength on his side, but I will make the challenge anyway, and I will make it publicly, and that will buy time. Time for your mortal lawyers to file appeals. Time to find another way to contest his claim. Willa stared at him. You would fight a battle you know you cannot win. I would fight a battle I will almost certainly lose, Hadrian corrected. There is a difference. I have survived worse odds before. When? He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, became distant and old. Would you like the truth? He asked quietly. About where I come from? About who I was before this? He gestured vaguely at himself, at the vampire he had become. They had talked about his past in pieces, fragments he had offered and she had accepted, but never the whole story, never the deep truth of it. Willa realized suddenly that she wanted to know, wanted to understand the man beneath the king. Yes, she said. Tell me. Hadrian moved to the bench and sat down, and after a moment Willa sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The fire crackled in the stove, and outside the rain continued its relentless drumming against the roof. I was born in a river town, Hadrian began, his voice low and careful, as if he was choosing each word deliberately. My father ran a ferry, crossing people from one bank to the other for a few coins. It was not much, but it was enough. We had a house, food, a life. I was the eldest of 4 children, and when I was 14, my father began teaching me the ferry, how to read the current, how to angle the boat, how to keep people calm when the water was rough. He paused, staring at his hands. In the firelight, the scars on his forearms were more visible, pale lines against pale skin. I was 17 when the flood came, he continued. It had been raining for weeks, the kind of rain that just does not stop, and the river was rising every day. People were leaving, heading for higher ground, but there were always a few who waited too long, who could not leave their homes until the water was already in their streets. Willa waited, sensing there was more, something painful coming. A family came to the ferry landing at dusk, Hadrian said. A mother, a father, 3 children. The youngest was maybe 5 years old. They needed to get across, to where the road climbed into the hills. I told them it was too dangerous, that the current was too strong, but they had nowhere else to go. Their house was flooding, so my father agreed to take them. His hands were clenched now, knuckles white. I was supposed to stay on the shore, to manage the ropes, but my father needed help. The boat was overloaded, barely above the waterline, and the current was vicious. Halfway across, something hit us from upstream. A tree, whole and uprooted, traveling like a battering ram. It caught the side of the ferry and flipped us. Willa reached out and covered his hand with hers, and Hadrian looked at her as if surprised to find her there. "I remember the water," he said. "Black and freezing and so strong. I remember grabbing for the children, trying to hold on to them, but they just slipped through my fingers. I was not strong enough. I was just a 17-year-old boy, and the river was ancient and merciless, and I was not strong enough." "How many?" Willa whispered. "How many did you lose?" "All of them." His voice cracked on the words. "The mother, the father, all 3 children, and my own father, who tried to save the youngest and was pulled under. I was the only one who made it to shore. I crawled out of that river alive, and I have hated myself for it ever since." Willa tightened her grip on his hand. "It was not your fault. You were a child. You did everything you could." "I know." Hadrian turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. "Intellectually, I know. I have had 4 centuries to process it, to understand that I was not responsible for the flood or the tree or the choices that put those people on the ferry that night. But knowing does not erase it. It does not change the fact that I was weak when I needed to be strong, that people died because I could not hold on to them." "Is that why you turned?" Willa asked. "To be strong enough?" "That is why I accepted the turning when it was offered, yes." Hadrian leaned back against the wall, his eyes distant. "I spent years after the flood trying to be stronger. I worked, I trained, I built muscle and skill, but I was still just human, still limited. And then one night, when I was 23, I met a vampire who saw something in me. He offered me a choice: stay human and die eventually, weak and forgotten, or become something more. Become strong enough that I would never lose anyone to my own limitations again. And you chose strength. I chose to never be helpless again." He looked at her, and his eyes were fierce. "I chose to be the kind of creature that could carry people through floods, that could stand between the ones I loved and any danger. I have built my entire existence around that choice. I became king because kings have the power to protect, and I married you because I wanted to protect you, and I will challenge Severin because I will not, cannot stand by and watch you lose something precious due to my failure." Willa felt something shift in her chest, a sudden clarity. "You are still trying to reach them," she said softly. "The people in the river. Every time you protect someone, every time you carry someone to safety, you are trying to make up for the ones you could not save." Hadrian closed his eyes. "Yes," he said simply. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 400 years of guilt hanging between them. Willa thought about the man Hadrian had been, the boy who had tried so desperately to hold on to slipping hands in dark water. She thought about the choices he had made since, the way he had shaped himself into something that could bear any burden, withstand any current, and she thought about the conversation they needed to have, the one that had been lurking at the edges of their relationship since the beginning. "I cannot turn," she said quietly. Hadrian opened his eyes. "I know." "My bloodline," Willa continued, needing to say it out loud to make sure they were both facing the truth plainly. "My grandmother had it tested when the vampire world first became known to us. Some human lines can accept the turning, can survive the transformation, but mine cannot. The change would kill me, not convert me." "I know," Hadrian repeated. He said it gently, without accusation or resentment, just stating a fact they both already understood. "So this," Willa gestured between them. "Us. This marriage. It has an expiration date. I will age, I will die, and you will continue. 40 years, maybe 50 if I am lucky, and then you will be alone again." "Yes." The simplicity of his answer was almost shocking. No platitudes, no false comfort, just acknowledgement of the reality they faced. "That does not frighten you?" Willa asked. "It terrifies me." Hadrian turned to face her fully, and she could see the truth of it in his eyes, the fear that lived beneath all his careful control. "I have not loved anyone in 400 years, Willa. I have cared for people, I have felt loyalty and affection and even desire, but I have not loved. I buried that capacity the day I crawled out of the river because love meant vulnerability, and I had built myself into something that could not afford to be vulnerable. And then I came along. And then you came along, he agreed. Arguing about farm subsidies in a city council meeting, fierce and stubborn and absolutely unafraid. And I looked at you and thought, there is someone worth protecting. And then I thought, there is someone worth knowing. And then, against all my better judgment, I thought, there is someone worth loving. He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, the way he had outside by the floodwater, his touch cold and careful. I know this will end, he said quietly. I know I will watch you age, will stand beside your bed when you are old and dying, will bury you the way I buried my mortal family centuries ago. I know all of that, and I chose you anyway. I am choosing you anyway, every single day. Willa felt tears spilling over, running hot down her cheeks. Why? She whispered. Why would you do that to yourself? You could have married someone who could turn, someone who could be with you forever. Why choose the grief? Because the alternative is worse. Hadrian's thumbs brushed away her tears, his expression unbearably tender. The alternative is continuing to exist without living, is spending centuries going through the motions without feeling anything real. You make me feel alive, Willa. You make me remember why I wanted to be strong in the first place. Not to avoid pain, but to protect something precious. I am not precious enough to justify the pain, Willa said. But Hadrian shook his head. That is not your decision to make, he said firmly. I am 463 years old. I have the right to choose how I spend my time, and I choose to spend it loving you. However long we have, it will be worth it. The grief afterward will be worth it, because the alternative is the slow death of never risking grief at all. Willa leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, closing her eyes. I wish I could stay with you, she whispered. I wish I could promise you forever. I know. Hadrian's arms came around her, pulling her close. But I do not need forever. I just need you, as you are, for as long as we have. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other, the fire warming the small hut while the storm raged outside. Willa felt something settle in her chest, some tension she had been carrying since the night Hadrian first explained what their future would look like. She had been so focused on what they could not have, on the years they would lose, that she had not fully appreciated what they could have. A life, a real human life, lived fully and deliberately. Not immortality, but something better, something chosen. What will you do? She asked eventually, her voice muffled against his shoulder. After I'm gone? Hadrian was quiet for a moment. I will honor you, he said finally. I will tell your story, make sure your name is remembered. I will protect the valley, make sure it stays in your family's hands for as long as your line continues. And I will keep living, because you would want me to. I will keep being a good king, keep protecting my people, keep doing the work that matters. He pulled back slightly so he could see her face. And I will remember that I had something real, something worth the grief. That will be enough. Willa nodded, trusting that he meant it, that he had thought this through with the same careful deliberation he brought to everything. We should talk about the practical things too, she said, wiping her eyes. If I am going to live a mortal life, a full human life, there are things we need to plan for. Children? Hadrian asked, and there was something cautious in his voice, as if he was afraid to hope. Willa had been thinking about this, turning it over in her mind during the long nights when Hadrian was in his court and she was alone in the valley. I want them, she said. If we can, I want children. I want to give you that before I cannot anymore. Hadrian's expression did something complicated, joy and fear and longing all tangled together. It is possible, he said quietly. Difficult, but possible. There are very few recorded cases of vampire human offspring, but they exist. The children would be human, or mostly human. They would not inherit my nature. But they would have time with you, Willa said. They would know their father even if they could not follow him into eternity. Yes, Hadrian took a shaking breath. I would like that. I would like it very much. They talked through it then, all the practical details they had been avoiding. Where they would live, how they would split their time between the valley and the vampire court, how they would explain their unusual marriage to Willa's human family, how they would raise children who would grow up knowing their father was different, ancient, something outside normal experience. It was complicated and messy and full of potential problems, but it was also real, a future they could actually build together. The valley will need to stay in mortal hands, Willa said. I do not want it absorbed into vampire holdings after I die. Can we structure the inheritance so it passes to our children or to my brother's family if we have no children? Easily, Hadrian nodded. I will set up trusts, legal protections that exist in both mortal and vampire law. The valley will be yours and then your children's in perpetuity. Severin will have no claim, and neither will any vampire after him. Thank you. Willa leaned against him again, exhausted but peaceful. For all of this. For choosing the complicated option instead of the easy one. You are many things, beloved, Hadrian said with a hint of amusement, but you have never been easy. Willa laughed, the sound surprising her. I suppose I have caused you a great deal of trouble. The best kind of trouble. He pressed a kiss to her temple. The kind that makes existence interesting. They fell silent, and Willa found herself listening to the rain, which was finally beginning to ease. The storm was passing, the worst of it moving on, and in a few hours the floodwater might recede enough to cross safely. But dawn would come first. You should rest, Hadrian said. You are exhausted, and we still have decisions to make when the sun rises. What decisions? Willa asked, though she was already half asleep, the warmth of the fire and the safety of Hadrian's arms pulling her down into darkness. Whether to wait for the water to recede, or whether I attempt to cross in daylight. His voice was distant, thoughtful. Whether I risk the sun to reach Millbrook before the registry office closes for the day. Willa wanted to argue, wanted to tell him absolutely not. He would not risk burning for a piece of bureaucratic paper, but sleep was claiming her too quickly. She felt Hadrian shift, lowering them both to the floor so she could lie more comfortably, and then there was nothing but warmth and darkness and the distant sound of rain. When Willa woke, pale gray light was filtering through the cracks in the hut's walls, and Hadrian was standing by the door, staring out at the dawn. She sat up quickly, her body aching from sleeping on the hard floor, and saw that he had positioned himself carefully in the shadows, avoiding the light. His face was tight with concentration, and she realized he was in pain, just from the diffuse light of an overcast morning. Hadrian, she said, scrambling to her feet. Get away from the door. The water has receded, he said, not moving. Not much, but enough. There is a path we could take through the shallowest part. We could reach the road and from there, the town. In daylight. Willa moved to stand beside him, staying carefully in the shadows. You cannot cross in daylight. I can for a time. He was still staring at the pale landscape outside, calculating distances and risks. The cloud cover will help. If I move quickly, if I do not stop. You will burn, Willa interrupted. You said it yourself, sunlight burns vampires. I am old enough to heal from it. Hadrian finally looked at her, and his eyes were steady, resolved. It will hurt, but I will survive. And we need that registration, Willa. Without it, everything we have risked is meaningless. Willa wanted to argue, wanted to find another solution, but the truth was there might not be one. The registry office in Millbrook operated on mortal hours, and those hours were limited. If they waited until nightfall, the office would be closed, and they would have missed the deadline. Unless. What if we do not go to Millbrook? Willa said slowly, an idea forming. What if we find another way to register the marriage? Hadrian frowned. The law requires registration in the district where the claim is being made. Millbrook is the only registry office that covers your valley. But the law also allows for emergency registrations, Willa said, remembering something her grandmother's lawyer had mentioned once. In cases of extreme hardship, A notary public can witness and certify a marriage, and those documents can be submitted to the registry after the fact. As long as the marriage itself occurs before the deadline, the registration can be formalized later. Hadrian stared at her. Is there a notary public within reach? There might be. Willa grabbed her coat, which had dried overnight by the fire. Small towns often have someone certified to handle basic legal documents. If we can reach the nearest village before noon, before the deadline actually passes, we might be able to find someone. Hope flickered across Hadrian's face, quickly suppressed. It is a significant risk. If we are wrong, if there is no notary, or if they refuse to certify, then we are no worse off than we are now, Willa said. But if it works, you do not have to cross in daylight. We find shelter, we wait out the day, and we handle the formal registration tonight. Hadrian considered this, and Willa could see him turning it over, looking for flaws. Finally, he nodded. All right, we try, but we need to move quickly before the water rises again. They left the hut, stepping out into a gray morning that was at least no longer pouring rain. The floodwater had indeed receded, leaving behind a landscape of mud and debris, tree branches, and scattered belongings from houses upstream. A narrow path was visible through the shallower water, exactly as Hadrian had said. They crossed carefully, Hadrian once again carrying Willa on his shoulders through the deeper sections, and by the time they reached the road, the sun was a pale disk behind the clouds, climbing higher. Hadrian kept to the tree line where possible, staying in the shadows, but Willa could see the tension in his body, the way he flinched when the light found him. The nearest village was called Ashford, a cluster of houses and shops that existed primarily to serve the surrounding farms. They reached it just before 10 in the morning, muddy and exhausted, and began asking for a notary. The third person they asked, an elderly woman sweeping her front steps, nodded and pointed them toward a small house at the end of the main street. Martin Thorne, she said. He does legal work for folks around here, notary, taxes, that sort of thing. Martin Thorne turned out to be a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a practical demeanor. He listened to their story, examined the vampire marriage certificate that Willa produced from the waterproof bag, and nodded slowly. I can witness and certify this, he said. But you understand it will need to be submitted to the proper registry within 30 days for it to be fully legal in mortal terms. We understand, Willa said. We just need it done before noon today, before the deadline passes. That I can do. Martin pulled out the necessary forms, had them each sign and swear to the truth of their statements, and then added his own signature and seal. There, he said, handing the documents back to Willa. Married in the eyes of the law. Congratulations. Willa stared at the papers, at the official stamps and signatures, and felt something loosen in her chest. They had done it. Against all odds, through floods and storms and impossible crossings, they had done it. Hadrian paid Martin generously, in cash that somehow had stayed dry despite everything, and then they stepped back out into the gray morning. We need shelter, Hadrian said quietly. His skin was starting to look strained, tight across his bones, and Willa realized the diffuse sunlight was affecting him more than he wanted to admit. Somewhere dark, where I can wait out the day. The village church, old and stone, had a basement that the pastor was willing to let them use after Willa explained that her husband had a severe sun sensitivity. They descended into the cool darkness, and Hadrian sagged against the wall with visible relief. I am all right, he said when he saw Willa's expression. It is just uncomfortable, being this close to daylight. I will heal once the sun sets. Willa sat beside him on the floor, too tired to care about the dust or the cold. We did it, she said. The valley is safe. You did it, Hadrian corrected. You thought of the notary, the emergency registration. I was ready to burn crossing to Millbrook. We did it together, Willa said firmly. You carried me across the river. I found the legal loophole. Partnership. Hadrian smiled, a real smile this time, warm and genuine. Partnership, he agreed. I like that. They spent the day in the church basement, talking quietly and dozing in shifts. Willa called her family from Martin Thorne's office, letting them know she was safe and the marriage was registered. Her mother cried with relief, and her brother demanded to know every detail of the adventure, and Willa found herself laughing as she described the river crossing, the flood, the desperate trek through the storm. When the sun finally set, Hadrian emerged from the basement looking himself again, strong and steady and no longer in pain. They borrowed Martin's car to drive back to retrieve Hadrian's vehicle, which was exactly where they had left it, still parked at the edge of the vanished bridge. The bridge itself was still gone, the river still high, but crews were already at work on the far bank, beginning the process of rebuilding. Willa stood at the edge and looked at the water, remembering the feel of it trying to pull her under, remembering Hadrian's strength holding her above it. "I was terrified," she admitted quietly. "When we went into the water, I thought we would die." "I would not have let that happen," Hadrian said. He stood beside her, his hand finding hers. "I told you the river cannot have you, because you are strong enough to stop it now, because you are precious enough to fight for." He squeezed her hand gently. "There is a difference." They drove back to the valley that night, taking the long way around, through roads that had stayed dry and safe. When they finally pulled up to Willa's family home, her mother was waiting on the porch, and she pulled Willa into a fierce hug that spoke of all the fear and relief of the past 24 hours. Hadrian stood back, giving them space, but Willa reached out and pulled him into the embrace as well. "Family," she said firmly. "You are family now." Her mother looked at Hadrian for a long moment, and then nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for keeping her safe, for fighting for our land." "It is my land now, too," Hadrian said. "And my fight. You do not need to thank me for protecting what is mine." The formal challenge came 3 days later, delivered by courier to Hadrian's court. Severin, enraged by their successful registration, was demanding a hearing before the High Council, claiming the marriage was fraudulent, that the emergency certification was invalid, that the mortal laws did not supersede vampire claims. Hadrian read the challenge in his study, with Willa sitting across from him, and then set it aside with a calm she did not feel. "He will lose," Hadrian said. "The law is clear. Mortal property is governed by mortal courts, and your registration is legal. But he will make it difficult, will drag it through every level of appeal he can manage. So we fight him in court," Willa said. "Mortal court, vampire court, whatever it takes. We fight him," Hadrian agreed. "Together." The High Council hearing took place 2 weeks later, in the great chamber beneath the city, where the oldest vampires gathered to settle disputes that could not be resolved by single courts. Willa attended as Hadrian's wife, dressed in formal clothes borrowed from the court's extensive wardrobe, and watched as Severin made his case. He was ancient and cruel, exactly as Hadrian had described, with eyes like chips of ice and a voice that carried centuries of authority. He argued that the valley had been promised to his house, that mortal laws were irrelevant to vampire business, that Hadrian's marriage was clearly a strategic ploy to circumvent legitimate claims. Hadrian responded with calm precision, citing laws and precedents, presenting the certified marriage documents, and making it absolutely clear that the valley was now under his protection and would remain so. But it was Willa who turned the tide. She stood before the council, a mortal woman in a room full of immortal predators, and told them about her family. About the generations who had worked the valley, who had built lives there, who deserved to keep what they had earned through sweat and sacrifice. She told them about the flood, about the bridge that had vanished, about Hadrian carrying her across on his shoulders because he understood what it meant to protect something precious. And then she looked directly at Severin and said, "You claim the valley by right of an old promise, but promises have two sides. What did your house do to earn the valley? What did you build? What did you protect? What did you sacrifice? My family earned our land through labor and love. What did you do except wait for a chance to take it?" The silence in the chamber was absolute. Severin stared at her with undisguised fury, but he had no answer, because the truth was he had done nothing. He had simply found an old document and decided to exploit it. The High Council ruled in Hadrian's favor unanimously. The valley would remain with the Grayson family, protected by Hadrian's authority as king, and Severin's claim was dismissed as baseless. Outside the chamber, Hadrian pulled Willa into a fierce embrace. That was dangerous, he said into her hair. Speaking to the council like that, challenging Severin directly. You could have made a powerful enemy. I already have a powerful enemy, Willa pointed out, and I have an even more powerful husband. I think I will manage. Hadrian laughed, the sound surprised and delighted. Yes, he said. I think you will. The forged claim documents that Severin had used were exposed 3 days later, when Willa's family's lawyers did a deep investigation and discovered the original papers in a forgotten archive. The signature that supposedly bound the valley to Severin's house was proven to be a fake, added decades after the document was written. Severin was censured by the High Council, his reputation damaged, his claim obliterated. He retreated to his own holdings and did not bother them again. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Hadrian split his time between his court and the valley, managing his kingdom while also learning the intricacies of orchard management and small-town politics. He attended town council meetings with Willa, sat in on her family dinners, and slowly, carefully, became part of the community. The valley prospered under their combined attention. Hadrian's resources allowed for improvements that had been impossible before, new equipment and irrigation systems and experimental crops. But he was careful to let Willa and her family make the decisions, understanding that the land was theirs to steward, not his to control. And in the quiet moments, in the late evenings when they sat on the porch of the old farmhouse and watched the sun set over the orchards, Willa felt herself falling deeper into love with this strange, ancient, careful man who had chosen to tie his immortal life to her brief human one. A year after the flood, they stood on the newly rebuilt bridge and looked down at the river, which was running calm and clear in the summer light. I still dream about it sometimes, Willa admitted. The crossing. The feeling of the water trying to pull me under. I dream about it too, Hadrian said. But in my dreams, I lose you. I feel you slip from my shoulders, and I cannot reach you in time. Willa turned to face him, seeing the old fear in his eyes, the terror that still lived beneath his control. But you did not lose me, she said. You held on, and we made it across, and we are here. We are here, Hadrian repeated. He looked at her with an intensity that still made her breath catch. And I will hold on, Willa. For as long as we have, I will hold on. I know, she said. I trust you. And she did, completely, absolutely, without reservation. 2 years later, Willa discovered she was pregnant. The news sent Hadrian into a spiral of careful, controlled panic that would have been funny if it had not been so touching. He read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could find, consulted with vampire healers who had experience with mixed bloodline births, and generally drove Willa slightly mad with his anxious hovering. But beneath the anxiety was joy, pure and uncomplicated. He wanted this child with a fierceness that sometimes scared her, wanted the chance to be a father, to have a family again after centuries alone. Their daughter was born on a spring morning, healthy and squalling and entirely human. They named her Diana, and Hadrian held her with such careful tenderness that Willa cried watching him, seeing the way he looked at this tiny person as if she was the most precious thing in the world. She has your eyes, Hadrian said, his voice thick with emotion. Look, Willa, she has your eyes. Diana did have Willa's eyes, dark and bright, and Hadrian's pale hair, a startling combination that made her look like something out of a fairy tale. She grew up knowing her father was different, that he could not go out in daylight, that he was older than countries, but to her, he was simply Papa, who read her stories and taught her chess and made her feel safe. 3 years later, they had a second daughter, and then a third. Penelope and Violet, both healthy, both entirely human, both adored beyond measure. The valley thrived, the orchards producing record harvests, the community growing stronger. Willa's brother finished his degree and came home to work the land, bringing new techniques and fresh energy. Her mother lived to see her granddaughters grow, and when she finally passed, peaceful in her sleep at 83, they buried her in the valley cemetery beside Willa's father. Hadrian stood at the grave with Willa, holding her as she cried, and when she finally looked up at him, she saw tears on his face as well. I did not expect to love her, he said quietly. Your mother. I thought I would simply tolerate her for your sake. But she was kind and strong, and she welcomed me into her family without hesitation. I will miss her. She loved you too, Willa said. She told me once that she was glad I had married you, because she knew you would take care of me after she was gone. I will, Hadrian promised. Always. The years passed, and Willa aged as humans do, gaining lines around her eyes and silver in her hair. Hadrian remained unchanged, eternally young, eternally strong. But he looked at her with the same love he had shown on their wedding night, as if she was still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They talked about it sometimes, the approaching end, but not with fear or regret. It was simply a fact of their life, something they were both preparing for in their own ways. I want to be buried in the valley, Willa said one evening when she was 53 and starting to feel the weight of years. With my family. Of course, Hadrian said. And I will visit. Every year on your birthday, I will come and tell you about the valley, about our daughters, about everything you are missing. You will find someone else eventually, Willa said. After enough time has passed, you should not be alone forever. Hadrian shook his head. I have had my great love, he said. I do not need another. This was enough, Willa. You are enough. When Willa was 61, she fell ill. It was cancer, aggressive and fast-moving, and the doctors said there was little they could do. She had perhaps 6 months, maybe less. Hadrian took her home to the valley, to the farmhouse where they had spent so many happy years, and cared for her himself. He sat beside her bed and read to her, played her favorite music, held her hand through the worst of the pain. Their daughters came, grown women now with families of their own, and they filled the house with love and laughter and the sound of grandchildren playing in the orchards. Willa watched them from her bed and felt a deep, abiding peace. She had lived a good life, a full life, rich with love and purpose and meaning. She had saved her family's land, had built a life with a man who cherished her, had raised daughters who would carry on her work. She had done everything she had set out to do. On a quiet morning in early autumn, with Hadrian beside her and her daughters holding her hands, Willa slipped away. Hadrian sat with her body for a long time, not crying, just holding her hand and remembering. The night they had met, the river crossing, the way she had looked at him in the shepherd's hut and seen past the vampire king to the lonely man beneath. The way she had chosen him, chosen their complicated, beautiful, impossible life together. Finally, he pressed a kiss to her forehead and whispered, "Thank you for everything, for choosing me." They buried her in the valley cemetery, beneath an oak tree that had been there since before the Graysons came. Hadrian stood at the grave with his daughters and grandchildren around him, and when they lowered the casket into the ground, he felt something break inside his chest, something that would never quite heal. But he had promised to live, to keep going, and so he did. He remained king, ruling his court with wisdom and fairness, protecting his people as he always had. He visited the valley often, watching his daughters grow old, watching his grandchildren have children of their own. The Grayson line continued, strong and healthy, and the land stayed in their hands, protected by laws and trusts that Hadrian maintained scrupulously. Every year, on Willa's birthday, he came to her grave and told her about the year that had passed, about the family she had built, about the legacy she had left. He brought her flowers from the orchards she had loved, and he sat beneath the oak tree and remembered. The grief never fully left him, but alongside it was gratitude. He had spent 43 years loving Willa Grayson, had known the joy of a real marriage, a real family. He had held his daughters as babies, had watched them grow into remarkable women. He had lived, truly lived, in a way he had not managed in the 400 years before Willa. And that, he decided, was worth the pain, worth the grief, worth the loss, worth every moment of the brief, brilliant life they had built together. 60 years after Willa's death, they finally finished the permanent bridge over the river, a massive structure of steel and stone designed to withstand floods that would make the one from that night look like a spring shower. The town held a ceremony for the opening, and they invited Hadrian as a guest of honor, because everyone knew the story by then, the legend of the vampire king who had carried his bride across the river on his shoulders. Hadrian attended, dressed in modern clothes that he still found slightly uncomfortable after all these years, and stood with Willa's great-great-grandchildren as the ribbon was cut. "She would have liked this," Diana said beside him. She was in her 60s now, her dark hair streaked with white, but she still had Willa's eyes. "Mama always said infrastructure was important." Hadrian smiled, remembering Willa's passionate arguments at town council meetings, her determination to improve life for everyone in the valley. "She would have," he agreed, "and she would have fought for better funding for maintenance." Diana laughed, and the sound was so much like Willa's that it hurt. But it was a good hurt, the kind that reminded him he had something worth hurting over. They walked across the new bridge together, Hadrian and Diana and the whole crowd of Willa's descendants, and when Hadrian looked down at the river flowing beneath them, he thought about that night so long ago. The rain, the darkness, the desperate crossing with Willa clinging to his shoulders. The night he had proven to himself that he was strong enough, that he could hold on, that he could protect what was precious. The night he had chosen love over safety, chose vulnerability over isolation, chose a brief, bright joy over an eternity of cold distance. It had been the right choice. He would make it again, without hesitation, knowing everything that would come after. Because Willa had been right, that night in the shepherd's hut when they had talked about their impossible future. The time they had was worth more than the time they did not have. The love they had built was worth more than the grief that followed. And as Hadrian stood on the new bridge, surrounded by the living legacy of the woman he had loved, he felt something he had not felt in 6 decades. Hope, not for new love, not for forgetting, but hope that the life he had lived with Willa, the family they had built, the changes they had made in the valley and beyond, would continue to matter, would continue to grow and spread and touch lives he would never meet. That was its own kind of immortality, he realized, not the physical kind he had chosen centuries ago, but something better. The immortality of love passed down through generations, of stories told and retold, of a life lived so fully that its echoes continued long after the living were gone. He could live with that. He could carry that forward, through whatever centuries remained to him, because that was what Willa would have wanted, for him to keep going, keep protecting, keep honoring the brief, beautiful time they had shared. And he would. For her, and for himself, and for the family that bore her name and her strength, he would hold on.